Chapter 52. Cars were a rarity in Kolo, and people walked everywhere, and it was always either uphill or downhill, unless they were walking in the small area in and around the marketplace or were on the road that led to the railway station. Bullock carts with squeaky wheels were still to be seen occasionally, and some people owned bicycles, but even these were few and far between. Our family and that of the Shirazis were two of the few families in town that each owned a vehicle. The Shirazis, who were members of a large extended family, had a little black car that was fairly new at the time, so they had probably purchased it in 1949, before the imports of cars into Burma was restricted. At lunchtime and after school, with her cousins, Gladys, Beryl, Shirley, and Patrick, bundled themselves into their chauffeur-driven tiny black car and were transported home. Our car was a Jeep, and my first view of it was from the veranda upstairs. It was a new, typically khaki-colored army vehicle, and it stood there in the morning light on the driveway beside the plum tree in front of the house. One warm day in March, about 8 of us drove to Pyoboy in the Jeep. Khalid, our cousin, Chota Baji's eldest son, who had by now settled in Pakistan, had come to visit us for a few days. I have no recollection of anything immediately before or after the trip, so there we remain, like a live photograph forever frozen in time, somewhere on the road to Pyoboy, with the hood of the Jeep folded down and the wind and dust blowing into and through our hair. What I do remember is that Khalid had extra tender feelings for my eldest sister, Rafia, who didn't reciprocate his feelings. He gave me a bottle of sweet-scented lotion, and I must have misunderstood that it was for me, because when I showed it to Rafia, she said that he had really intended it for her. She was obviously right, and maybe she accepted it because I didn't see that bottle again. I remember cutting a fresh lime in half, sprinkling it with salt and chili pepper, and offering it to Khalid. Just the memory of it makes my mouth water, but he didn't appear too eager to sample it. With the Jeep came Maunsan, our Shan chauffeur, who was a small-made, spry little man who enjoyed driving us to school occasionally and dusted and polished the Jeep till it gleamed. On one occasion, my father drove to the tennis court, and of course we climbed into the Jeep as well. Maunsan, who had come along to help set up the equipment, lifted out the heavy net from the Jeep and dragged it onto the court. Then, using as much energy as he could muster, he huffed and puffed as he tightened the bolts to the post. The strenuous effort he applied resulted in a loud expulsion of wind from his hindquarters, which gave us silly children cause to laugh uproariously then and every time after that when we recalled the event. The Jeep wouldn't start one morning, so Maunsan and Arthur attempted to start the engine by inserting the long metal crank into the front of the car and repeatedly rotating it clockwise to no avail. Then, with the two of them leading a bunch of us, we pushed it to the top of the hill. Once we got it there, Maunsan quickly jumped into the driver's seat and tried to start the engine, while the Jeep freewheeled down the hill. We were almost out of breath as we raced back down the hill, and even though we couldn't hear the sound of the engine, we hoped the car had started. As we approached the Jeep, we saw Maunsan muttering to himself, and from the expression on his face, we could tell that he was using some choice swear words in Shan. He finally walked around to the front of the Jeep, and as a last resort, lifted the bonnet to check the engine. He looked, and then leaning forward, looked again, and then stepped back with a look of amazement, exclaiming, "Doka anaisa anata," suffering impermanence and egolessness. Contemplating these three is the basis of wisdom in Buddhism, and it didn't appear that Maunsan was at that moment practicing his faith. Then lowering his voice, he grumbled, "Kue de ga koyu twa bi." The dogs have stolen it." Not quite comprehending, we crowded around and were looking at the engine when Arthur said, "Oh my God, the battery's gone." Chapter 53. Whenever I recall our days in Kalo and think of my sister Raffia, I see her as she was back then. Long, thick, deep black hair and flawless skin, so that when I heard the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I always thought they were describing this sister of mine. I had the greatest admiration for her. She was always smartly dressed, a great artist, an intellectual who seemed knowledgeable about everything and could also do anything, and I was especially impressed when she was only 16 and learned to drive a car. All of us younger siblings, that is my sister Rihanna, Farouk, Bilkis, and myself, looked up to her, and not once have I felt that she didn't deserve it. I remember my sister Raffia struggling to learn Burmese after we came back to Kalor. Never having had to study it before, it must have been a difficult task, but she worked hard at it. Because now in Burma, there was no chance of a university education without it. She had to start by learning the alphabet. Burmese is a tonal language, and she had tremendous difficulty with it, because carrying over the emphasis of a word from the English language to Burmese, or pronouncing a word in a certain octave or pitch, gave the word a totally different meaning. This resulted in mistakes, which were extremely embarrassing for her, especially when they were considered hilarious by those who spoke the language fluently. When we first returned to Kalor, there was no electricity available, and we used the yellow light of a small kerosene lantern after dark, which was usually by about 6 o'clock in the evening. We would go upstairs, and soon the wick in the lantern was turned down, the light went out, and there was immediate complete darkness, and we fell off to sleep. One day, there arrived at our house a giant wind charger. This was carefully carried up, positioned, and securely attached to the roof, and then connected to a generator which sat in a small storeroom beside the kitchen. We thought this was a marvelous idea and anticipated having light bulbs brightening our home in every room. Sheltered as it was in the midst of interlocking hills, Kalor was not a windy town, so it could not have been a very strong wind that rushed past the blades of the wind charger, causing it to swing into action. It shook and rattled the roof, making such a huge commotion that we thought the roof itself was about to be dragged off and blown away. We quickly settled back to using the kerosene lantern. Later we advanced to a gas lantern, which Raffia would light by first igniting the white spirit, and then, using the little pump on the side of the base, she would repeatedly pump the small metal plunger. We would hear a steady hiss as a beautiful blue flame rose from the filament in the center, and then a white light emanated from the lamp and lit up the room. We sat at the large oval teak dining table, tipped our dinner plates this way and that, and watched the light catch in the worn, crisscross patterns of the porcelain, while we waited for the food to arrive. My brother Farouk weighed 11 pounds when he was born. Not even 2 years younger than I, he quickly grew taller than I was, and for a while people thought we were twins, till he soon towered above me. When we returned to Kalor after the war, our father allocated each of us little handkerchief-sized plots in the garden, and Farouk and I had ours side by side on the ground between the 2 cherimoya trees by the front of the house. The soil was a deep brown, almost black, and it crumbled easily in our hands. As each of us dug a shallow hole, we could smell the earth. It smelled like rain and embedded itself under our fingernails. We got a couple of small onions from the kitchen and placed it in the ground, covered it loosely with mud, and watched with wonder as it seemed that in no time at all, pointy green stalks shot up out of the ground. We spent so much time in other activities that we almost forgot about them. But the soil was rich, the rain sufficiently plentiful, so that the next time we looked, our delight, there were these beautiful flowers poised on the tips of the long stems, fulfilling Harvey's quote about the soil of Burma, where he said, "You tickle the earth with a hoe, and you get a laughing harvest." I recollect one day when Farooq was probably about 8 that Paddy, the dog, bit him. I don't remember whose dog she was at the time, but she had a habit of chasing after cyclists, and it was on one of those occasions when Farooq was trying out the bike that had just one pedal that Paddy raced along beside him and suddenly decided to nip his leg. A little later that evening, Farooq stood on the veranda upstairs and looking toward the sunset said, "Look, the sun is setting." Usually rather quiet, I looked at him with great concern, hoping that the bite had not affected him. Just like all the other scratches and bruises we collected, the bite healed quickly, and my brother was none the worse for it. He grew up to be most charming and a gentleman in every way, which when added to his dashing good looks caused swarms of girls to go swooning over him. My younger sister Bilkis, whom we called Billy, had about her this joy of living that has never left her to this day. Some of the things I remember about her as we were growing up linger in my memory and color my vision of her even now. She seemed to absorb and relish the air about her the way a cat would, as it uncurled and stretched itself on a lush rug. When she ate anything, such as a green chili, raw onion, or other tosia, she would pick it up and then, retracting her perfectly shaped lips, would bite it with teeth which had the luster, whiteness, and shape of baby teeth, still slightly curved rather than cut straight across the biting edge, and make the simplest of foods seem delicious. She had soft silken curls, a deep dark brown, almost black, circling her head, held like a flower on her long neck. And her eyes were a soft brown, etched with lashes that turned up, pointing towards eyebrows, horizontal, and starbursts almost meeting in the middle, above a small straight nose, gently rounded at the tip. Her voice and laughter like hollowed silver striking glass, and there was lots of laughter in her eyes, which crinkled at the outer edges. She had a way with words, so that she had a quick, witty retort that would take one by surprise and result in a response of speechlessness or laughter. She was small-boned, slender-framed, and dynamic. The sunlight etched the short, white-puffed sleeves of her dress with the little blue flowers and glanced off the bouncing dark curls on her head as we played jump rope and sang, "Two little dicky birds sitting on the wall." We were playing under the veranda in the porch way in front of our home with our friends who lived down the road. Two of us turned the rope while Bilkis skipped in the middle, and then suddenly she tripped on the rope and fell, bumping her head on the hard floor, and fainted. We stood around horrified, but she soon came to, and to this day seems none the worse for her fall. She loved to skip and continued to excel at this activity when we became boarders at the convent. She would start skipping while we counted 1, 2, 3, 100, 200, 1,000. "Stop!" we would say, as her little legs kept going, and she would finally stop, not because she faltered, but because we felt an exhaustion she didn't feel. I remember the excitement around her 5th birthday. She didn't know it, but our mother had made her a beautiful dress. It came down in frilled layers of gathered white lace, which had pastel embroidered flowers along the edges. We gathered around her and asked her to close her eyes. The dress was then put on her, and we waited with bated breath to see her response as she opened her eyes. I wonder if the delight she showed pleased us more than the dress pleased her. She remained the baby of the family till we returned to Kolo after the war, and my brother Salim was born. Salim was a beautiful baby with large soft brown eyes fringed with eyelashes that have been the envy of every girl. The first inkling I had that my mother was pregnant was when my cousin Maimuna whispered to me that my mother was going to have a baby. I got furious with her, perhaps because of the way she said it, as if it was something to be ashamed about, so that I thought it wasn't a nice thing to say about my mother. I'm sure my older siblings knew, because my sister Rafia, who was 17 years old at the time, told us younger ones that there was going to be a surprise for us in a few days. My mother had, for the latter part of her pregnancy, started sleeping in the guest room on the ground floor of the house. I still had no clue, not until that morning when we found a baby boy lying in the crib beside my mother. I think that those who knew about my mother's pregnancy anticipated the birth of a girl, because all the bedding in the crib had been made with pink fabric. My ignorance of the biological processes involved in the creation of new life remained shockingly inadequate right up to the age of 19, when I was still under the assumption that babies popped out of the navel. This daunting lack of knowledge of human anatomy and physiology was finally quickly dispelled later in university when I fell in love with a medical student who presented me with a copy of the Kinsey report. All of us adored this beautiful new baby in our family, who unfortunately was barely a year old when my father passed away. But with the large number of older siblings he was never deprived of love or attention. He had the sweetest disposition and amused and intrigued us. I loved telling him stories, which I made up specially for him, in which he was the main character. When he was about 6, he sat on my desk while I was studying one day, and picking up my geometry set, began playing with the apparatus in the box. I was engrossed in a mathematical problem I was trying to solve, and didn't notice what he was doing when he suddenly said, "Ouch!" I looked up, and to my horror, I saw the point of one end of my divider stuck in the middle of his hand. I immediately pulled it out without thinking, and was amazed to find that it didn't bleed. He appeared to be no more the worse for it, and the small wound in his hand healed in a few days. Chapter 54. The food was carried in from the kitchen, which was adjacent to the dining room, but separated from it by a porch. The door to the kitchen was made of heavy wood, either teak or pingodo, and was locked at night. As you entered the kitchen, there was a row of wide shelves along the left wall, and at the end of the shelving, in the corner on the left, was a square concrete area on the floor, about 3 feet by 3 feet, enclosed by a very low concrete lip, not more than 4 inches high. This functioned as the dishwashing area, where a short metal pipe lined up against the wall. At the top end of this pipe was a tap that had a strip of rust-stained cloth hanging down from it, having been securely tied to the handle at the top to control the flow of the water and stop it from splattering. Here, Yasin, our cook, would sit on a small chowki, a very low wooden stool, and wash the dishes, slaughter a chicken, throw a basket over it while it flapped about, and wait till it lay still. It was also in the vicinity of this kitchen sink that he would sit on the floor and press his toes against the coconut scraper and expertly, holding half a coconut in his cupped hands, shred the meat against the serrated blade in preparation for making cowsware. It was a laborious process to get the juice out of the shredded coconut by placing it in a muslin cloth, immersing it in hot water, and then squeezing the cloth till every bit of coconut milk had been drawn out. The food he cooked was delicious, but apart from our culinary connections with him, he was also very closely linked to us in other ways. He had left Burma with us during the war, stayed on with us in Bombay, and returned with us in the ship across the Bay of Bengal, and had known most of us from the time we were born. Yasin had been with us since he was a young man, and I remember him as he must have been in his early 30s or late 20s. He was slender, of medium height, and the high cheekbones of his face emphasized his soft dark eyes and a generous mouth. His skin had the brownness of many centuries of sun. He had a wife and children, but they remained in a small village in India, somewhere in the state of Bihar, and we never saw them. He sent back most of his salary to support his family and took some time off every year or two to visit his gaon or basti, as he would say, and return with interesting snacks for us, like sweetened puffed chickpeas. On the same side as the doors to the kitchen was another wall of shelves with more pots and pans, and adjacent to that was a big black Aga stove. The top of the stove was black with soot and grease, which Yasin wiped off with a safi that was invariably also almost black. The day we lost the tennis ball while playing 7 tiles in the garden, he was wearing his usual checked loungie and a white shirt. We looked all over the area, in the garden, everywhere, and I somehow walked into the kitchen and saw Yasin busily cutting up some meat, carefully separating the fat from the lean with a sharp knife. I walked over to one of the handis that was placed upside down along with others on the shelf along the wall and lifted it up. There sat the tennis ball. I was 8 years old at the time and amazed to find the ball there, yet I cannot explain why or how. I am moved by some homing instinct to find that ball where it had been hidden, probably by a mischievous cook. I have somehow retained that strange, almost psychic instinct for finding lost things even today, especially those that my husband cannot find and which are usually directly in front of him. Chapter 55. Ahmed. One year, while Yasin was away on an extended visit with his family, my father prepared for a business trip to Rangoon. We climbed into the jeep and sat on the hard metal seats that were positioned above the tires and held on to the cross-metal rods on the sides. The wind blew against my face, stinging and drying my eyes as we wound our way around the bends in the road to drop Papaji to the Heiho airport. It was early morning, and Rafia was sitting in the passenger seat beside my father, who was driving. As we approached Heiho, the road curved around a hill with a wide valley dropping sharply away on our right, enveloped in mist. It felt like we were airborne. Rafia, who had recently learned to drive, drove us home after my father boarded the aircraft. When my father returned, he brought with him a replacement for Yasin, who had gone back to his village in Bihar to visit his family. Ahmed was not more than 19 or 20 years old, was of medium build, light-skinned, had neatly cut, oiled and combed, straight black hair, and a pleasant round face. He was shy and quiet as he went about his work in the kitchen, and was probably slightly intimidated at the boisterous household of 9 children. Our father was away on another business trip around the time that we developed a keen interest in learning how to ride a bicycle. At first we practiced on one of our own bikes, which was much too big for most of us younger ones. It had only one pedal, but we learned how to balance on it with one foot, hang on to the bicycle without getting onto the seat, which was too high for us, and roll the bike along. The frustration of doing this eventually forced us to use the services of the small bicycle shop at the bottom of the hill beside the mosque. We started renting bikes from there because the shop had smaller bikes perfect for us to practice on. We walked the bicycles up the road to the top of the hill and then freewheeled all the way back down past our house to the end of the road at the bottom of the hill. Ahmed gradually became more comfortable with us and watched us from the front gate as we practiced on our little bicycles. The fun we were having one day was too much for Ahmed to resist, and he asked if he could also try riding on one of our little bikes. We were quite happy to have him participate, and he got onto one of the small bikes we were using. He, like us, didn't know how to ride a bike, so he walked the bike up to the top of the hill and, straddling the seat, stretched out his legs, his feet extending way past the pedals because the bike was too small for him. He laughed as the bike sped down the hill, freewheeling all the way, the wind whipping his hair back. Suddenly, in one swift motion, he flew off the bike, up and over the handlebars, landing headfirst into the deep concrete drainage gutters on the side of the road. He sort of climbed out of the runnel and sat down on the grassy bank beside the road, holding his head. We got him into the jeep, and Rafia drove him to the hospital. He never came back. They buried him on the hillside in Sher Basti, in the cemetery below which the stream flows and the railway track curves, bringing people and taking them away. Chapter 56. The compound within which our house was situated was probably less than half an acre, but soon my mother had a small duck pond built beside the woodshed that stood just outside the kitchen wall. A team of ducks paddled about in the water that was contained in a square concrete enclosure about 2 feet high and about 8 feet wide. There was a specific time when we fed them, and they waddled up to us in their varied shades of brown and white feathers, with the shiny, dark green bands around the necks of some, the shuffle of their webbed feet over the gravel merging with their sharp, snorty quacks. In that space just outside the dining room door, on the kitchen side of the house, sat a large gunny bag of coal, conveniently placed for use in the large Auger stove. It was from around this bag of coal, as I walked by one day, I saw a large black king cobra slither away past the duck pond. Besides these ducks that paddled in the pond, we also had a few large white ducks that had red crests and turkey-like red appendages above and beneath their chins, whom to this day I have not been able to accurately identify. We call them mandarin ducks, but they were nothing like the creatures we named them after. They were always flying across into the grounds of the Ponji Chow across the street, and had to be craftily caught and brought back. This was no easy task, because these heavy birds struggled and squawked as we carried them home. We also had a few hens and a rooster in another little shed beside the pond. The eggs lay in the hay, and sometimes not in the hay, as on the day I heard a red leghorn clucking loudly, and as I watched, she ran in a frenzy through the yard and into the house, seeking a place to lay her egg. She finally plunked down into a felt hat that lay on the big round wooden table in the living room and laid her egg. Behind the house was the small cowshed where our mother had installed a lone black cow. We watched in wonder as she delivered a beautiful golden brown calf with a star on his forehead. For the first few days after the calf was born, we collected the special milk, rich with cream, which was probably stealing what was biologically meant for the calf. We promptly named the calf Chand, which meant moon. I don't know why we didn't call it Sitara, star, which would have been more appropriate. He soon grew into a gangly creature and would come trotting up to the front gate to meet us as we returned from school. We had adopted Paddy just before she nipped Farouk's leg and continued to keep her and another little black pup that looked like a little teddy bear and whom, of course, we named Teddy. More interesting than the dogs we had was the cat, a typical Burmese cat, but atypical in that she was a Baluchang, monster cat. She deposited a litter of 6 kittens in a safe place, which she decided was on some linen that lay on a shelf in one of the gigantic teak cupboards in the large hallway by the bedrooms upstairs. We were delighted at the cute little creatures who had their eyes closed tight and seemed to be sleeping all the time. But a few days later, we were horrified to see their heads lying around, and we discovered that she had devoured her kittens. In those days, it took a lot to horrify us because we ourselves poured kerosene on the beautiful hairy caterpillars and ignited them, and it didn't occur to us that it was cruel. Where did we learn to do this? It was as if they were inanimate objects that just happened to crawl around and sting us occasionally. Are children innocent or just ignorant and primitive? Why do I feel remorse now? How could I have been party to such a crime? Today I would judge myself harshly and classify this as evil, sadistic, psychopathic behavior, because I literally cannot kill a fly now, but rather trap them in a container and then let them loose outdoors. Do we as children work through all the behaviors we are capable of and gradually eliminate those that are not beneficial for the survival of the species? Is it perhaps that in psychopaths, this mechanism for filtering and eradicating non-beneficial traits is faulty or non-existent? Chapter 57. Over in the corner of the bombed-out property next door stood a lean-to made up of large sheets of corrugated iron. In this metallic cubicle lived a man with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks. His thin body was racked by coughing, and he seemed to be wasting away. He lived alone, a relic of the war that had left him bereft of family and friends. When did he come and when did he leave? He just disappeared one day, he and his shack. In its place, and occupying most of the plot, now stood a long building with walls of yellow-brown bamboo matting and its roof of thatch. Inside was a large hall, occupied by a huge billiard table, its green velvet top adorned with red, black, white, and blue balls. Here a few men converged to play. The owner, whose name fades from memory, was a stock Burmese gentleman who always wore the traditional checked longi or passeau and a short black jacket. In one corner of this large structure was an area no more than 10 feet by 10 that was sectioned off with a bamboo partition. The floor was raised, and this one room was where the owner, his tiny, plump, fair-skinned wife, and 2 young daughters lived. It was their bedroom, kitchen, and living room. The older of the 2, who was about 7 years old, was dark-skinned, resembled her father, and was named Anu, literally meaning brown, while the younger fair-skinned one, who looked like her mother, was named Apu, meaning white. Both girls were beaten regularly and mercilessly with a bamboo cane for whatever the parents considered a misdemeanor. The mother was the one who sold tickets for a popular lottery and was my introduction to gambling at a very young age. Bets were placed on one of a series of birds or animals, and then there was a draw, the winner multiplying his deposit many times on the creature that turned out to be the one that was drawn. I don't remember the details of how I managed to place the bet or who placed it for me, but I was supposed to have spoken in my sleep before the results were out and said, "Chep Wimby," literally meaning, "the hen has opened," which happened to be the one my bet had been placed on. The next day I discovered that I had won 50 pyars, which was half a chut, the equivalent of about $5 in today's currency. My early success at winning created a strong attraction to the one-armed bandits that I later encountered in England, But my own recognition that this could become a problem for me has kept me away from gambling ever since that first time. Not long after my big win on the lottery, a baby was born to Anu's mother, and the family, now numbering 5, continued to live in the small corner of the billiard hall. In a sudden gush of entrepreneurship, I decided to stitch a dress for their baby. So, with Farouk's assistance, I threaded my mother's sewing machine and, using a small scrap of pretty purple fabric, stitched what could pass as a garment of sorts before the top plate beneath the needle snapped somehow. It didn't deter me from trying to sell the slightly unfinished product to Anu's mother for her baby. She politely declined my offer, saying that it wouldn't fit because it was too small. A few years later, while a boarder at the convent, we were taken to the market on market day as a special treat. There I met Anu's mother, and she smiled happily to see me, and then pressed a shining 50 paise piece into my hand against my weak objections. I also came across Anu in the market. She was carrying the baby on her hip, and I found out that Anu had become the one who stayed home, cooked and cleaned, and took care of her mother's new baby. Her face was almost completely covered in tanaka, and I wondered if it was an effort to raise herself from the demoted position she held in her family because of her color. Apu, the younger, lighter-skinned sister, was given the privilege of getting an education by attending St. Agnes's convent.